At 56, the tragedy of Will Smith is beyond heartbreaking, not because he fell, but because he fell on the very night the world finally crowned him. For 3 decades, he was Hollywood's son, the kid from West Philadelphia who laughed his way out of fear, the rapper who made parents roll their eyes and teenagers sing along, the leading man who saved Earth on Friday and saved our faith in fathers on Sunday. He was the smile that closed a wound. He was proof that charisma could be a kind of mercy. But the story behind that smile was never simple. In his memoir, he writes, "I always thought of myself as a coward because I saw my father hit my mother and I didn't do anything." That sentence is a trap door. Once you step through it, the legend looks different. Humor becomes armor. Discipline becomes a religion. Success becomes a negotiated peace with a childhood that never stops echoing. He won the first ever rap Grammy with DJ Jazzy Jeff, history etched in gold, yet the category wasn't televised, and some of the genre's giants boycotted the ceremony. Imagine holding a trophy while the room refuses to look up. That's not fame. That's a performance of acceptance without the feeling of belonging. Will carried all of it: fear, pride, tenderness, rage into roles that felt less like movies and more like confessions. When he bled in alley, he was fighting history. When he wept in the pursuit of happiness, he was protecting a promise he once failed to keep. When the Academy finally said best, the boy inside him finally heard enough. And then in a single burning second, everything he built collided with everything he buried. The crown slipped, the mask cracked, the night split into two lives, the one he earned and the one he must now live with. But what the world didn't see is how the first wound, long before the Oscars, bent every choice he ever made. In love, in art, and in the quiet rooms no camera enters. Will Smith was not born into greatness, he built it brick by brick, beat by beat, smile by smile. To most of the world, he is the man who defined an era, the blockbuster king whose name could make audiences laugh, cry, and believe all in the span of 2 hours. But to those who've looked closer, Will Smith is something more complex, an alchemist who turned pain into art, a perfectionist terrified of failure, and a man who spent his life trying to master the chaos within him. He grew up in a house that looked ordinary from the outside, in the quiet Winfield neighborhood of West Philadelphia. But inside those walls, discipline and danger were daily companions. His father, Willard Smith Sr., was a man of power and precision, the kind who fixed refrigerators by day and ruled his household by night. His mother, Caroline Bright, was the calm within the storm, a school administrator whose love for learning became her son's first refuge. It was in that collision between order and tenderness that Will's inner world was forged. He once said that everything he has ever done came from trying to protect his mother. That sentence is the Rosetta Stone of his life. Every joke, every performance, every perfectly rehearsed smile, it all started the night he froze, while watching his father strike the woman he adored. That single act carved his identity into two halves: the performer who could charm any crowd, and the child who could not save the one person who mattered most. In the decades that followed, Will became a master illusionist. He learned that humor disarms fear. When you make people laugh, they stop asking questions. When you radiate confidence, they can't see the cracks. From the schoolyard to the stage, laughter became his shield in performance, his salvation. By the time he hit his teenage years, the boy everyone called the Fresh Prince already understood a truth that would define his career. Charisma is control. It was that control that launched him from the small Philadelphia scene into the heart of hip-hop's golden age. With DJ Jazzy Jeff, he found rhythm, recognition, and the intoxicating power of applause. Together, they turned suburban stories into anthems, creating a new lane for rap, one that was clever, clean, and universal. For a time, he was untouchable. Rich, famous, adored. The dream was real, until it wasn't. By 21, the IRS had taken it all. Money gone. Reputation tarnished. The same charm that had lifted him now mocked him. He was broke, betrayed by his own success. But out of that collapse came the phone call that would rewrite his destiny. Quincy Jones, the godfather of musical reinvention, summoned him to a party and demanded he audition for a new sitcom on the spot. Will hesitated. Quincy didn't. "Do it now," he said. "Take the shot or lose the moment." So Will did. And in that living room, surrounded by laughter, history was made. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air was born not just as a TV show, but as a second life. Overnight, he became America's favorite son, street smart yet lovable, rebellious yet safe. It was the perfect disguise for a young man still learning how to silence his demons. But fame doesn't heal, it amplifies. Behind the jokes and quick wit, Will carried the same haunted energy he had as a child. The relentless need to prove, to perform, to be loved without condition. Hollywood gave him the world, but it also demanded he keep smiling while the weight grew heavier. To understand Will Smith's tragedy, you have to see beyond the laughter. You have to see the boy inside the superstar, still trying to make the pain beautiful. Because every triumph he ever had, from Grammys to Oscars, was not just ambition, it was survival. And every scar he carries tells the same story, that sometimes the price of perfection is peace. The rise of Will Smith was not only cinematic, it was mythic. But as every myth teaches, the higher you climb, the deeper the fall that awaits. Long before Hollywood lights and red carpets, there was a boy named Willard Carroll Smith Jr. growing up under a roof that could switch from laughter to fear in a heartbeat. Born on the 25th of September 1968 in Philadelphia, Will was the second of four children: Pamela, the eldest sister, and the twins, Harry and Ellen, the youngest. Their home smelled of engine oil and chalk dust. His father's tools stacked in the garage. Two worlds, mechanical precision and quiet compassion, coexisted uneasily under one roof. His father, Willard Sr., was a military-minded man who believed that control and fear kept chaos away. He demanded order in every detail, from perfectly lined shoes to perfectly silent children. He loved deeply, but expressed it through strictness that bordered on tyranny. His mother, Caroline, was his opposite, a patient, determined woman who believed that intelligence and grace were the keys to freedom. Together, they built a life that looked steady from the outside, but the fault lines were always there, waiting. Will later said that his childhood home was not poor, but never safe. That sentence lingers like a ghost. One night, when he was just 9, safety vanished completely. In the heat of an argument, his father struck his mother so hard she collapsed. Will stood frozen, watching, unable to move, unable to speak. That moment branded him. Years later, in his memoir, he confessed, "I always thought of myself as a coward for not protecting her." From that point, humor became his armor. If he could make his mother laugh, maybe she would forget her pain. Every punchline was a shield. Every joke, a desperate peace offering. He learned to read moods like weather, detecting danger in the twitch of an eyebrow. The tension of silence. This became the secret weapon of his career, an instinct for emotion so sharp it could disarm anyone, from an audience to a critic. But it was born not from confidence, but from survival. At school, Will was clever, restless, and charming, a natural talker who could win over teachers even as he bent the rules. His classmates nicknamed him Prince, not because of royalty, but because he could get away with anything. That name would soon evolve into the identity that changed his life: the Fresh Prince. Outside of school, the city itself shaped him. West Philadelphia was alive with rhythm and wordplay, rap battles on corners, beats echoing from basement parties. The late 1970 seconds and early 80 seconds were the birth of hip-hop, and for Will, it was salvation. He discovered that rhyme could do what silence never could: turn pain into performance. At 12, he was already experimenting with lyrics, crafting rhymes that were funny but never cruel, sharp but never violent. His mother didn't like profanity, so he built his craft around cleverness. "If you can't curse, you'd better be twice as creative," he'd later joke, and he was. By 16, Will was performing at local shows with Jeffrey Towns, the DJ who would soon become his lifelong creative partner, DJ Jazzy Jeff. The duo was electric. Jeff spun records with surgical precision, and Will filled every gap with a grin and rhythm that made everyone feel included. They weren't just rappers, they were storytellers. While others rapped about street survival, Will rapped about parents, girls, and teenage chaos. He gave hip-hop a new language, one that crossed boundaries of race and suburb. His flow was funny, charming, and smart, a mirror of his personality. In 1986, the pair recorded "Girls Ain't Nothing But Trouble," a playful hit that caught radio fire. Suddenly, the Fresh Prince was more than a nickname, it was a brand. Record labels came calling. By 1988, their single, "Parents Just Don't Understand," exploded across America. The song's humor, paired with a beat kids could dance to, turned rebellion into family entertainment. And then came history. Will Smith, barely 20, became the first rapper ever to win a Grammy Award for Best Rap Performance. But that golden moment was tainted. The category wasn't televised. Many of the biggest names in rap boycotted the event, believing the industry still didn't respect them. So while Will held his Grammy, smiling for the cameras, he felt the silence in the room. The applause was polite. The respect was missing. To the streets, he was too clean. To critics, too commercial. For a boy who had spent his whole life trying to be loved by both sides, the strict father and the gentle mother, it was déjà vu. Once again, no matter what he did, someone was disappointed. Still, success brought money. And money brought freedom, or so he thought. Lavish spending, poor advice, and youthful recklessness drained his fortune fast. The IRS came knocking, and by 21, he was broke. It was humiliation disguised as a lesson. I had a hit record, a Grammy, and suddenly I was broke, he admitted later. Flat broke. The fall was swift and public. He had tasted glory, only to be thrown back to the bottom before he could even celebrate. But life, as always, had its strange timing. Just as the walls closed in, destiny appeared in the form of Quincy Jones, the legendary producer. At a Hollywood party, Quincy urged Will to audition for a TV show, right there, on the spot. No rehearsal, no second chances. Will hesitated, but Quincy insisted. By the time the night ended, Will Smith had been cast in a new sitcom, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. The boy who once hid from his father's rage had just become the face of laughter across America. That transformation, swift, improbable, and poetic, was more than a career break. It was a resurrection. The frightened boy from Philadelphia had turned his pain into power, his fear into fame. But even as his star began to rise, the ghosts of childhood lingered. The coward who froze at 9 years old still whispered inside him, and no amount of laughter could silence it. Because no matter how far he ran, Will Smith would always carry the memory of that first broken night. The story of Will Smith's early career is a symphony of rebirth, a melody composed of chaos, charisma, and second chances. By 1990, the boy from West Philadelphia who had lost everything was suddenly reborn under studio lights as the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But what the audience saw as effortless success was, for Will, a desperate climb out of the ruins of debt and humiliation. His life had collapsed, and then Quincy Jones, with his uncanny instinct for destiny, handed him a lifeline. The show was lightning in a bottle. It blended comedy and culture in ways no sitcom had dared before. For the first time on American television, a young black man could be funny, rebellious, and vulnerable, all at once, not as a stereotype, but as a fully human being. The character of Will, the street-smart kid sent to live with his wealthy relatives in Bel-Air, wasn't just fiction, it was autobiography wrapped in laughter. Beneath the jokes, it was a meditation on identity, a boy torn between where he came from and where he was told he belonged. Behind the scenes, Will was a sponge. He studied his co-stars like a scientist dissecting brilliance. James Avery, who played Uncle Phil, became a second father to him, stern, intellectual, and full of quiet gravitas. In one emotional moment during filming, after Will delivered a powerful scene about his on-screen father abandoning him, Avery pulled him close and whispered, "Now you're an actor." That line would stay with Will forever, a baptism of truth on a studio stage. But success, like fame, is rarely pure. Will's instincts for control, born from childhood chaos, began to surface. He memorized not only his own lines, but those of every other actor. Terrified of being caught unprepared, every episode was an obsession. The same drive that once made him the perfect student now made him a perfectionist performer. By the third season, the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air had become a cultural phenomenon, launching him into global stardom. Yet inside, the fractures widened. He had money again, but the fear of losing it haunted him. He had fame, but the pressure to maintain it was suffocating. "I felt like I was playing a character named Will Smith even when the cameras were off," he later said. "I didn't know who I was if I wasn't performing." After 6 seasons, the series ended in 1996. The final episode aired to millions of viewers, and as the set emptied, Will stood alone in the fictional living room that had become his sanctuary. The lights dimmed, and silence filled the air, the same silence that once haunted his childhood home. But this time, it wasn't fear, it was gratitude. He had survived his first act, then came Act Two, the movies. Hollywood opened its gates, and Will sprinted through them with the same fearless energy that had carried him out of Philadelphia. He was determined not just to act, but to dominate. His first test came with Bad Boys 1995, opposite Martin Lawrence. The chemistry was electric, the swagger unmatched. Audiences roared. The film turned Will into a bona fide action star. He was no longer the Fresh Prince. He was the man who could save the world. And save it he did spectacularly. In Independence Day, 1996, he punched an alien and declared victory for mankind. The film grossed over $800 million worldwide, and Will became the symbol of summer blockbusters, charming, brave, invincible. A year later, Men in Black, 1997, cemented his place among Hollywood royalty. The black suit, the Ray-Bans, the effortless smirk, it all became part of American pop culture. Will Smith wasn't just acting anymore. He was defining an era. But behind every explosive success was exhaustion. The more he conquered, the more he feared slipping. He began building his life around metrics, box office numbers, audience ratings, media perception. Every failure felt like a threat to his identity. In private, he was the man who could never stop working, never stop proving, never stop performing. He would later say, "Imparted from rhyme." During this time, Will's personal life began to mirror the rhythms of his career, loud, fast, and fragile. His first marriage to Cherie Zampino ended in 1995, a heartbreak that cut deeper than any career setback. He had promised himself as a boy that he would never let his family break apart the way his parents had. But he couldn't hold it together. Divorce was the ultimate failure, he admitted years later. The pain of that loss followed him like a shadow one he would carry into every relationship that came after. Yet from that same heartbreak came rebirth once again. In 1997, Will married actress Jada Pinkett, fiery, brilliant, and unafraid. Together, they became Hollywood's golden couple, a fusion of intellect and charisma, the perfect mirror image of the empire he had built. They shared not just love, but ambition, and that ambition would take him higher than ever. Through the late 90s and early 2000s, Will became the most bankable movie star in the world. Enemy of the State, Ali, I, Robot, Hitch, The Pursuit of Happiness, I Am Legend. The hits seemed endless. Each film, though different, carried the same current. A man battling against impossible odds, carrying pain with dignity, refusing to break. They weren't just characters, they were fragments of his soul. By the time Men in Black 2 arrived in 2002, Will Smith wasn't just a name, he was an industry. His movies didn't just sell tickets, they defined seasons. Studios planned entire years around his releases. The boy who once hid behind jokes was now a global powerhouse, the face of success itself. But deep down, the quiet question remained. If the world only loves the version of you that never fails, the higher the climb, the heavier the crown. Will had become everything he dreamed of, yet the same weight that had once pressed on a frightened 9-year-old's shoulders still followed him everywhere he went. Only now, it was gilded in gold and broadcast to the world. And just as the world prepared to celebrate his invincibility, fate was preparing to remind him how fragile it all really was. By the dawn of the new millennium, Will Smith wasn't merely a movie star, he was a movement. His name alone guaranteed success. Studios fought for his signature, brands courted his smile, and audiences worldwide waited for that familiar mix of swagger, sincerity, and soul. He was no longer just the Fresh Prince. He was Hollywood royalty, the man who could save the world, sell a soundtrack, and still make you cry before the credits rolled. In the 1,990 seconds, he redefined what a global superstar could be. Few had ever crossed so many lines of culture and genre with such grace. He rapped cleanly in an era of rage. He headlined blockbusters when few black actors could even dream of leading one. He became both the symbol of American optimism and its pressure valve, proof that charm, hard work, and faith could still overcome anything. At least, that's what the public believed. Behind the dazzling smiles and choreographed interviews, Will's world was a machine of discipline. Every move calculated, every image polished. He woke at dawn to study scripts, trained obsessively, and rehearsed interviews like performances. He treated success not as privilege but as duty. "I want to be the biggest movie star in the world," he once told Jada, and then he made it happen. With the cold precision of an engineer and the desperation of a man still proving he was not a coward. The streak was astonishing. Independence Day 1996 made him the face of global heroism. Men in Black 1997 confirmed his comedic brilliance. Enemy of the State 1998 showcased his dramatic depth. And Wild Wild West 1999, though critically mocked, barely slowed him down. He laughed it off, retooled, and returned stronger with Ali. Playing Muhammad Ali wasn't just acting, it was a possession. The role demanded physical transformation, spiritual discipline, and psychological unraveling. He trained until his body trembled, studied until his mind blurred, and absorbed the rhythm of Ali's speech until his own voice felt foreign. The fight sequences were grueling, and the emotional burden even heavier. "Ali was more than a man," he said later. "He was a storm I had to survive." The performance earned him his first Academy Award nomination, but it left him broken. The exhaustion lingered. The weight of embodying a legend only deepened his own fear of imperfection. He had stepped into the skin of greatness and discovered how suffocating it could be. Still, the world applauded. The crown fit tighter. Then came The Pursuit of Happiness, 2006. And something extraordinary happened. Will stopped acting. For 2 hours on screen, he lived as Chris Gardner, a father clawing his way through poverty and humiliation for the sake of his child. The rawness of his performance stunned even his critics. Behind each trembling line was a promise he'd made decades earlier that his children would never know the fear he once felt watching his parents fall apart. The film earned him his second Oscar nomination, but more importantly, it earned him peace. For a moment, the child inside him could breathe. He'd turned pain into purpose, tragedy into truth. At this point, Will Smith was untouchable. I Am Legend, 2007, dominated the global box office, turning loneliness into poetry. Hancock, 2008, turned a cynical drunk superhero into a metaphor for broken humanity. 7 Pounds, 2008, dissected guilt and redemption with quiet devastation. Every film felt like a sermon on survival, one more confession from a man trying to make peace with his own shadow. And yet, the higher he soared, the more fragile he became. His success had outgrown his soul. He once said, "Being the biggest movie star in the world doesn't mean being the happiest man alive." He smiled on red carpets, but the cracks were showing. He worked endlessly to please audiences, to protect his family's image, to keep control. But control, as he learned in childhood, was a brittle shield. By the 2010 seconds, the winds had shifted. A new generation of stars emerged rawer, louder, less polished. Will's invincible formula started to feel dated. The failures of After Earth 2013 and Collateral Beauty 2016 stung deeply. Critics who once worshipped his reliability now questioned his relevance. For a man who had built his identity on perfection, failure felt like exile. Meanwhile, the storm inside the Smith household began to grow louder. Jada, fiercely independent, was carving her own path. Their children, Jaden and Willow, were becoming icons of self-expression, brave, strange, and utterly uncontained. For a man obsessed with control, this new reality was disorienting. Love, it seemed, could not be managed like a film set. Still, even as the world shifted, Will continued to create. He built Westbrook, incorporated his own production powerhouse. He reinvented himself as a motivational figure, preaching positivity and discipline to millions online. But his optimism was no longer naive. It was forged in bruises, the kind you hide under designer suits and flawless smiles. And then came King Richard, 2021. For the first time in years, Will found a role that mirrored his soul completely. A father, flawed but devoted, fierce but loving. As Richard Williams, he played not a hero, but a man who believed that protection was love even when it hurt. The performance was unfiltered, honest, almost prophetic. It won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. That night, the applause thundered through the Dolby Theater. The boy who once froze in fear while his parents fought had conquered every stage, every doubt, every wound. He had finally earned the crown. But crowns have sharp edges. Only minutes later, the moment of triumph turned to tragedy. A joke, a glare, a step forward, and history shifted. The hand that had built his empire struck in fury. The slap echoed louder than any applause, and the man once beloved by millions became a global paradox. The hero who fell at the height of victory. It was as though every suppressed emotion from decades of control, every humiliation, every unhealed scar erupted in one fatal instant. And in that instant, the myth of Will Smith shattered. But tragedy is not the end of his story. It is the crucible that reveals what the legend was always hiding. Because after the fall, there is always the reckoning. The 27th of March 2022, the night that was supposed to seal Will Smith's immortality, instead became the night that cracked his crown. The Dolby Theater glimmered with the glow of history in the making. Cameras panned, hearts swelled, and for the briefest moment, everything he had fought for, the discipline, the pain, the control, had finally aligned. He stood at the peak of a career that had spanned 4 decades. The Oscar for King Richard was his, at last. But destiny, like fame, is cruel when you least expect it. A single joke, sharp, careless, and aimed at Jada, pierced the air. It was the kind of humor Hollywood trades in daily, the kind Will himself once delivered on countless stages. Yet that night, it wasn't just a joke. It was the echo of something older, deeper: humiliation, love, guilt, protection, all crashing together. In seconds, he rose from his seat, crossed the stage, and the world watched in disbelief as his open hand met Chris Rock's cheek with a sound that seemed to split reality itself. Gasps rippled through the room. The laughter died. Cameras froze. For one eternal second, Hollywood's golden man stood transformed, not as the hero who saved the world, but as the man who lost control of his own. The slap was not merely a physical act. It was a confession. Decades of discipline shattered. Years of buried shame erupted. The boy who once froze when his father hit his mother had finally moved, but in the wrong direction. The instinct to protect had twisted into violence. The past had found him again. That night, Will won the Oscar. He delivered a tearful speech about love and protection, about the chaos of human emotion. But even as he spoke, the applause rang hollow. The gold statue in his hand felt heavier than it ever should have. The very thing he had dreamed of since childhood had arrived hand in hand with his greatest humiliation. The fallout was swift and merciless. The Academy banned him for 10 years. Studios halted projects. The media, once his greatest ally, turned into an endless tribunal. Every headline screamed scandal. Every image replayed the same moment. His face twisted in fury, his hand raised, the disbelief of a world that had worshipped him. But the true punishment wasn't public. It was private. In the quiet days that followed, Will retreated from the world. He didn't run from what he did, he sat in it, alone, haunted. He later described the silence that followed as suffocating. It was a scar for life, he admitted. Nights blurred into sleepless hours. The moment replayed in his mind like a scene he couldn't reshoot. He asked himself the same questions over and over. Why didn't I stop? How did I let it happen? The hand that had lifted him to glory now symbolized his fall. The pain wasn't just his own. Jada became the lightning rod of speculation, blamed by some, defended by others. Chris Rock stayed silent for months, then spoke with measured defiance. Everybody knows what happened. It still hurts. The world had turned Will Smith, once the face of family-friendly strength, into a cautionary tale about ego, trauma, and the cost of emotional repression. Yet within the ruins, something rare emerged: honesty. Will began speaking publicly again, not as the untouchable star, but as a man stripped bare. In his YouTube apology, his voice trembled, his eyes heavy. "I hurt people," he said. "I regret it deeply." There was no performance, no armor, just a man trying to breathe through shame. For the first time in his career, vulnerability replaced control. The world debated endlessly: was it a breakdown, a love story gone wrong, or the inevitable result of a life lived under relentless perfection? But the truth was simpler and sadder. Will Smith's tragedy was never about one night. It was about the pressure of being perfect in a world that only loves its heroes when they don't bleed. Behind closed doors, he faced the consequences no camera could capture. Jada's public revelations about their separation since 2016 reopened old wounds. Fans called their relationship toxic, Critics called it theater. But for Will, it was personal, the unraveling of the one bond he had fought hardest to protect. He admitted he had built an identity on saving others, only to realize that some storms cannot be stopped. Even his children felt the tremors. Jaden and Willow, born under the glare of cameras, spoke of their own struggles with pressure, identity, and loneliness. Trey, his eldest, became his quiet confidant, the bridge between who Will was and who he still hoped to become. For Will Smith, the slap was never just an act of anger. It was the collision of every version of himself: the boy who couldn't defend his mother, the man who couldn't protect his marriage, the star who couldn't forgive himself. The tragedy was not that he fell, it was that he fell in front of the entire world. And yet, even tragedy can be a teacher. In the months that followed, Will began to rebuild. Not his image, but his humanity. He started therapy, practiced meditation, and turned his focus towards silence, the one thing he'd avoided his entire life. "You can't fix what you refuse to feel," he said quietly in one interview. It was as though for the first time he stopped performing and started listening to himself. Still, forgiveness is a long road. Hollywood's memory is short, but shame lingers. When Emancipation released in 2022, critics praised his performance, but audiences stayed distant. It was too soon. The wound was too fresh. Yet the deeper story of Will Smith is not about exile, it's about endurance. Every fall he has suffered, he has answered with rebirth. His career has always mirrored his inner life. Rise, collapse, rebuild. The slap was just another chapter in the same cycle, the price of being human in a world that demands gods. His tragedy lies not in what he did, but in what it revealed. That even the strongest among us are still haunted, children trying to make the world stop hurting for just one moment. And perhaps that is what makes Will Smith's story so unforgettable, not because he was perfect, but because he finally stopped pretending to be. In the quiet that followed the storm, Will Smith disappeared from the constant noise of Hollywood. No red carpets, no interviews, just stillness, the kind that feels heavier than sound. For a man who had spent his entire life performing, silence was the hardest role he'd ever played. Yet it was in that silence that something shifted. By 2023, Will had retreated into the hills of Calabasas, into the sprawling 150-acre sanctuary he built years earlier, part fortress, part temple. It wasn't luxury he sought anymore, but distance. The house, with its warm terracotta walls and winding stone paths, felt less like a mansion and more like a monastery of memory. Within those walls, he began to rebuild what fame had fractured, not his image, but his peace. He woke early, long before the sun rose, not to study lines, but to study himself. Meditation became his ritual. Journaling replaced scripts. He once said, "The universe doesn't punish you, it mirrors you." And in that mirror, he saw both the wound and the lesson. For the first time, Will allowed himself to live without an audience. Friends described him as quieter, more deliberate. He stopped chasing roles and started choosing purpose. He still worked films, music, projects, through his company Westbrook Incorporated, but the hunger that once drove him had softened. What replaced it wasn't resignation, but clarity. The boy who had once performed to survive had learned the art of standing still. Physically, the years had begun to show. The once tireless action star moved more slowly, his voice a shade lower, his laugh less explosive but more genuine. After his 2019 colonoscopy scare, he became devoted to health, training not for aesthetics, but longevity. He joked in one interview, "I used to work out to look good in slow motion. Now I work out so I can see my grandkids." There was wisdom in that humor, the kind born from loss and reflection. His family, fractured for years by fame and friction, slowly found their way back to each other. Trey, his firstborn, became his anchor. The two men, once distant, now inseparable, were often seen together at games, hikes, quiet dinners. "That's my man," Will said of Trey, his voice cracking just slightly. "He saved me." Jaden, ever the rebel spirit, had become his own force in music and fashion, a creative wanderer echoing both his father's daring and his mother's introspection. Willow, ethereal and fiercely intelligent, had evolved into one of the most authentic young artists of her generation. Her haunting songs spoke of vulnerability and self-acceptance, the very things her father had spent decades learning. "They're my teachers now," he admitted. And then, of course, there was Jada. Their marriage, once held up as Hollywood perfection, had long since become a mirror for the complexities of love itself. Years of separation, entanglements, and public confessions had stripped away the fantasy, but something remarkable survived beneath it all: respect. They no longer lived together as husband and wife, yet they continued to share birthdays, milestones, and family dinners. Life partners, Will called them, bound not by perfection but by purpose. Their relationship no longer resembled a fairy tale, it resembled endurance. Two people who had walked through fire, and though they no longer stood side by side, they remained bound by the ashes they'd both created. In 2025, when the Smith family gathered to celebrate Jada's birthday, photos emerged of laughter, of calm, no spectacle, no headlines, just a table filled with faces that had weathered storms together and still managed to smile. It wasn't redemption, it was peace. Financially, Will's empire remained colossal. His net worth hovered near $400 million, bolstered by decades of hits, production ventures, and real estate that spanned from California to Pennsylvania. But the wealth that mattered most to him now couldn't be measured in dollars. It was found in reconciliation, in forgiveness, in the quiet freedom of not needing to prove anything anymore. In interviews, his tone had changed. Gone was the relentless optimism of his younger self, replaced by something steadier, more grounded. "You can't outrun pain," he said softly. "You can only learn how to walk with it." By 2024, Will had begun to reemerge, not with grand announcements, but with purpose. His return to music after 2 decades, the album based on a true story, felt like a confession wrapped in rhythm. The standout track, Beautiful Scars, was exactly what it sounded like: a hymn to survival. "I stopped hiding what hurt," he said. "Now I let it sing. It is have be ebbed and stirred." He also returned to the screen. Bad Boys 4 roared past $400 million worldwide. A quiet but undeniable reminder that charisma, even wounded, doesn't die. Critics called it a comeback. Will called it continuing the story. But perhaps his most profound work came away from cameras altogether, in speaking to younger artists, in mentoring, in owning his mistakes publicly without disguise. The Fresh Prince had grown older, scarred, slower but real. The boy who once made people laugh to stop them from fighting had become a man who could sit in silence even when the world shouted. And if there's one image that defines Will Smith now, it's not him standing beneath flashing lights or holding golden trophies. It's him, sitting quietly on the steps of his Calabasas home at sunrise, watching light break over still water, his reflection finally steady. Because at 56, Will Smith no longer chases crowns. He builds peace. Will Smith's legacy is both a triumph and a warning, a reminder that greatness often walks hand in hand with fragility. His name may forever be tied to that one night at the Oscars, but to define him by that moment alone would be to misunderstand the magnitude of his story. His journey is not the story of a man who fell. It's the story of a man who kept rising, even after the world decided he shouldn't. Few entertainers in modern history have shaped culture as profoundly as Will Smith. Across 4 decades, he bridged worlds that had never touched before: rap and television and blockbuster cinema, fame and philosophy. Before Will, Hollywood had no blueprint for a black global superstar who could be both street and sophisticated, powerful yet playful. He created that blueprint himself. His influence runs deeper than his films. He changed the rhythm of pop culture. In the late 1980 seconds, when hip-hop was still considered rebellion, he made it accessible, charming, and mainstream. He introduced suburban America to rap through humor instead of aggression, rhythm instead of rage. DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince weren't just entertainers, they were ambassadors. Their success opened the door for artists who would later dominate music and cinema alike. Then, in the 1990 seconds, he redefined television. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air wasn't just a sitcom. It was a cultural bridge where class, race, and identity collided with laughter and empathy. Will's character brought the energy of West Philly to Bel-Air's polished veneer and made it universal. The show's emotional gravity, from comedy to heartbreak, shaped a generation that learned as much about love and forgiveness from Uncle Phil as from their own parents. When the world moved from TV to cinema, so did he flawlessly. Independence Day and Men in Black didn't just make money, they made myth. He became the face of optimism in an era of cynicism, the man who could save the planet with a grin and a one-liner. He was proof that charisma could conquer fear, that light could defeat darkness. In the post-Cold War years, Will Smith's heroes gave people something they didn't even realize they were missing: hope with swagger. But beyond the spectacle, there was substance. Films like Ali, The Pursuit of Happiness, and 7 Pounds revealed a performer willing to strip himself bare emotionally, confronting themes of faith, perseverance, and redemption. In those roles, audiences saw something rare: the fusion of vulnerability and power. That balance became his artistic signature. Then came the fall, and with it, a strange kind of evolution. The man who had once embodied perfection became the embodiment of imperfection. His apology videos, memoirs, and reflections became as culturally resonant as his blockbusters once were. People watched, not for entertainment, but for catharsis, to see how someone so adored could stumble, suffer, and still choose to rise with humility. In a culture obsessed with flawless heroes, Will Smith's greatest contribution may be showing that failure is not the end of the story, it's part of being human. He once said, "Pain is the greatest teacher, and I've been in class for a long time." And that, perhaps, is the truest shape of his legacy: not the laughter, not the box office, not the trophies, but the way he has turned his life into an open textbook of lessons on ambition, love, pride, and forgiveness. For many, Will Smith's influence will forever be nostalgic: the echo of the Fresh Prince theme song, the slow clap after Pursuit of Happiness, the swagger of Men in Black. But for others, his later years have revealed something deeper: a blueprint for resilience. In a world that consumes its heroes and discards them when they falter, Will's story reminds us that redemption is still possible, that scars can be both confession and crown. Culturally, his impact continues to ripple. His children, Jaden and Willow, are walking extensions of his artistic rebellion. They've inherited his refusal to conform, their creativity unbound, their self-expression fearless. Through them, his legacy transcends medium, becoming a living philosophy that art and truth, no matter how painful, are inseparable. Even Hollywood, which once turned its back after the scandal, has slowly begun to embrace him again, not as the flawless box office king, but as something rarer: a man who has lived enough to be wise. And in that wisdom, Will Smith stands not only as a legend, but as a mirror. His story reflects everything we admire and fear about fame: how it builds gods from mortals, and how it breaks them back down again. The tragedy of Will Smith is that his greatest lesson arrived wrapped in humiliation. The beauty of Will Smith is that he had the courage to face it, because his legacy, when stripped of glamour and noise, is a reminder of something timeless: that success is loud, but healing is quiet, that pain can destroy or transform, and that even when the world turns away, a man can still turn inward and find light. And perhaps that is how Will Smith will be remembered: not as the Fresh Prince or the hero who saved Earth, but as the flawed, luminous human who dared to keep walking after the world stopped cheering. Will Smith's story is one of the most haunting contradictions in modern celebrity history: a life built on light, undone by a shadow he could never quite escape. He is both the dream and the warning, the embodiment of how success can lift a man to divine heights while secretly hollowing him from within. At Celebrity Forgotten, we've studied many stories of fallen icons, but Will's tragedy strikes differently. His collapse wasn't born of scandalous indulgence or moral decay, it was born of humanity. One unfiltered, unguarded moment that ripped through the facade of perfection he'd spent decades constructing. For most stars, fame amplifies their ego. For Will, it amplified his pain. It's easy to mock the slap. The internet did for months: memes, jokes, endless replays. But beneath that 10-second clip is a lifetime of tension: the protector who couldn't protect his mother, the husband trying to defend his wife, the man who mistook reaction for redemption. It wasn't violence that defined that moment, it was the echo of every unhealed wound crashing into the present. And that's what makes Will Smith's fall so devastating. Because it didn't come from arrogance. It came from emotion, raw, unfiltered, tragically human. When we strip away the glamour, the Oscars, the numbers, and the noise, what remains is a man who has always been chasing something he lost as a boy: peace. He chased it through laughter, through fame, through control. But peace can't be earned through applause, it must be made in silence. Over time, that's exactly what he seems to be learning. The Will Smith we see today is not the same man who once declared he wanted to be the biggest movie star in the world. He no longer chases invincibility, he chases balance. We can't deny his flaws: the mistakes, the pride, the illusions he helped create, but we also can't deny his brilliance. He changed the shape of entertainment. He broke barriers, built bridges, and taught an entire generation that laughter and discipline could coexist. Yes, he hurt people, but he also healed millions through his films, his honesty, and the courage to tell his story when silence would have been easier. His fall was public, but his redemption is private, unfolding quietly, away from the lights that once defined him. In a way, that's the truest arc of all great stories, from innocence to greatness, from greatness to fall, from fall to wisdom. The myth of Will Smith isn't about the slap, the Oscar, or even the fame. It's about what happens when a man who has been everything finally learns to be himself. To many, his career will always be split in two, before the Oscars and after. But here, we see something different. Not a career divided, but a soul revealed. Will Smith has shown us that strength without reflection is just performance, and that vulnerability, though costly, is the only real victory. His tragedy, like all great tragedies, is also a mirror. It forces us to ask, how many of us are still performing for forgiveness? How many of us mistake control for healing? How many of us have built our crowns from pain, only to find they cut deeper than they shine? Perhaps that is why his story still resonates. Because in watching Will Smith rise, fall, and slowly rebuild, we don't just see a celebrity, we see ourselves. The fragile, flawed, resilient parts we hide from the world. He is no longer the Fresh Prince. He is something rarer, a man living honestly in the aftermath of illusion. And if his legacy teaches us anything, it's that even under the heaviest shame, light can still find a way through. There's something almost poetic about the way Will Smith's story loops back to its beginning. A boy who once used laughter to survive pain, now standing in the twilight of his life, trying to understand the silence he once feared. The Fresh Prince became a king, then a fallen one, and now something far more profound, a man who finally sees himself clearly. In his Calabasas refuge, mornings come gently. The sun hits the still lake, and the man who once fought for every inch of glory now watches ripples instead of ratings. The house that once rang with interviews and film crews now hums with quiet rituals. A journal, a cup of tea, the rhythm of breath against dawn. It's the kind of peace that doesn't need to be announced, the kind you earn only after losing everything that once seemed unshakable. Every now and then, a film poster catches his eye: Independence Day, Men in Black, Ali, The Pursuit of Happiness. Each one feels like a memory of a different life, a message from the many men he used to be. He doesn't disown any of them. He forgives them: the perfectionist, the protector, the fool, the fighter. Each carried a piece of him through storms that would have drowned anyone else. And when he laughs now, it's softer, slower, not to entertain, but to exhale. Some nights he still dreams of his father, the scent of oil, the sound of fists, the boy frozen in fear. But in these dreams, he doesn't stand still anymore. He walks toward the memory, places a hand on the shoulder of the man who once terrified him, and simply says, "I understand." That is what survival looks like when the lights go out. Will Smith's life will always be told in two halves: the ascent and the fall. But perhaps the truth lies in what came after, the quiet resurrection. The moment when the performer became a man, when control gave way to honesty, and when scars became stories instead of secrets. The tragedy of Will Smith is not that he fell, it's that the world mistook his fall for an ending, when in truth, it was the beginning of something more human, more raw, more real than any role he ever played. His legacy will outlive the noise. His films will still flicker across screens, his laughter will still echo in living rooms, and generations yet to come will still find courage in the boy from West Philadelphia who rose, broke, and rose again. Some stories burn bright and end fast. Others fade, then return gentler, wiser, carrying the weight of all they've survived. And this one will always linger, like the last note of a song that refuses to end. Because some stories were never meant to be known. But now, you know.